Good morning, everybody. So I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, which is Charlene Badger, and she's the Global Lead of Patient Advocacy at Illumina. So Charlene is the Patient Advocacy Lead at EMEA at Illumina. In this role, she leads the patient advocacy strategy and engagement across the fields of rare and undiagnosed genetic disease, reproductive health, and oncology. Trained as a medical sociologist, she spent 15 years leading academic research initiatives at the University of Cambridge and elsewhere that sought to elevate the impact of the patient voice in the development and implementation of novel and experimental medical technologies. So, if you want to come to the stage now, Charlene, thank you.
Thank you for that kind introduction, both Alan and Vicky. I do want to say something first, though. Even though I live in the UK, it feels very important to me to say this. I'm actually a New Zealander. And this is very important right now because as any good Pākehā white New Zealander, we have heritages that come generally from this part of the world. And so I have strong Irish ancestry, which makes it all the more important for me being here today. As it was said in my introduction as well, I have come to industry in a rather, in no disrespect to my industry colleagues, but as a medical sociologist. If anyone knows what sociology is about, it's about looking at power imbalances. It's often about looking at the structures that exist within society and where and whose voice is being heard and whose voice is not being heard. And so I entered the field of rare disease a long, long time ago at the point when if you were getting a diagnosis for rare disease, it was often because there was a clinician who had collected groups of families or people with similar phenotypes together and was hunting for the cause of that condition. And at that particular time when BRCA1, BRCA2, and those genes were being announced, in my work as a sociologist, I was incredibly intrigued by what is the impact of understanding your condition to have a genetic cause on people, on families, on how they view their relationships, on how they make decisions about their life. And so that's how I came to the UK to do a PhD, one of the first PhDs really exploring the social aspects of receiving a genetic diagnosis. So I come with this background that is very much at the heart. An advocacy passion is about what is the voice of patients, what are the experiences, how do we make experience and translate experience into evidence that can be heard across structures and across decision-making situations. So Vicky's asked me to talk a little bit about the future. And one of the things that's really struck me as the 1 in 17 posts have been going through is how many people in those, when the words that are chosen next to them have hope or hopeful next to them. And I kind of want to start with a quote. It's a quote from a philosopher who says that life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forward. And I think there's a real sense of that in the rare disease community, that we need to, at this point in time, understand where we are in history, where we've come from, and where we're going. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that in regards to diagnosis, what is happening in this space, where we're hoping to get to, and with a little bit of realism about where we are now. I can't start without highlighting, I guess, the very real experiences that people encounter in this space. And I'm very aware that in this room, I'm telling stories that you all live, and we have lived for many, many years. I want to introduce you to Charlie. Charlie is 15 in this photo. Her story is when I first met her family, they're from one of those villages where it's quite small, everyone knows everyone. Jodie and Terry, her parents, had grown up in the village, both of their families were in the village, and when they got together, there was much celebration. It was kind of one of those unions that, had been anticipated and hoped for. And when they got married, obviously from all accounts, it was a pretty big celebration. But then once they announced that they were having their first child, of course, all the family were involved. There was the great-grandparents were there, the grandparents were there, everyone was there. In fact, whenever I've been to their house, I've always encountered about three different grandparents, different aunties and uncles have all come in. So Charlie was born to much delight. There was, great anticipation around her birth and great delight. And everything seemed wonderful. She was born essentially meeting all newborn tests, looking healthy, looking great. About 6 months, and we'll be familiar with this story in terms of all our own experiences. About 6 months when, meeting developmental milestones, there seemed to be a few that just weren't happening. She wasn't sitting up, she wasn't able to move in some ways, seemed to be very late to coming to those milestones. In the family, there was still, again, she'll come to it in her own time, it'll be fine. And Jodie has a nursing background, and she was like, well, it'll be okay, she'll get there. And of course, the months ticked on, and still new milestones weren't being reached, or they were being very, very delayed. It was around 14 months, when Charlie was 14 months, that the assessment started. So Charlie had started moving about, sitting up at some point, but was struggling with, she did start walking, but there was a lot of delay. And so, as we know, investigations start. And there are tests, there are blood tests on very young children. There were all sorts of investigations, imaging tests, everything. At one point, one of the regular MRIs that they were having on a regular basis seemed to reveal something in a brain scan, and that was incredibly scary. They were rushed into hospital, but actually it didn't reveal the sinister diagnosis they thought was connected with it at that point. So it was back to the drawing board, and this continued for about 5 years in terms of every particular study that they could enter globally, they did. Hair follicles were sent around the world, lumbar punctures were done in order to try and investigate what's going on here. And the conclusion came that they didn't know what was happening. All they knew was that it was degenerative. When Charlie was about 5, Jodie and Terry tried to make a decision about were they going to have more children, what were they going to do? And they talked to a geneticist, they talked to a number of people, and they were told the chances of them having another child impacted by whatever it was that Charlie had were very, very slim. And so not long after that, Meg was born. And it was very apparent, very early perhaps, that Meg had the same symptoms as what Charlie did. And so, again, a whole other period of investigations occurred for both the girls. Although, as you see in this quote, Jodie talks about how Charlie was a bit of a guinea pig for both girls, went through endless testing to rule different things out. They tried everything. And this is really true. Little bits of the girls got sent all around the world in the pursuit of a diagnosis here. This is not just a blood test once in their lifetime. This is little bits of them being sent all around the world. They didn't know what it was, but obviously it was something regressive. Eventually, when Charlie was 10, a geneticist rang them and said, look, there's an opportunity here for a broader genetic test than what we've been able to do before. So obviously there'd been genetic tests in the past. There'd been a number of is this such and such syndrome? Is this, so a FISH analysis, is this such and such syndrome? And nothing had come back definitively. And the opportunity came for genomic sequencing, a broader scale genomic sequencing. And that resolved in a really interesting diagnosis. So they got a definitive answer after how many misdiagnoses. And this was the answer that essentially on the ADCK3 gene, there was a variation that was causing what was going on for both girls. Now, this is a cerebral ataxia. It affects movement. It explains all the reasons that the girls were not able to walk, that were the balance issues, also the cognitive issues. But the interesting thing about it is it affects the coenzyme Q10. Now, if I say CoQ10 to you, some of you might recognize what that is. If you go to a health food supplement, Flaxseed, often it has CoQ10 as a supplement. So this is essentially a supplement that the girls could then be given, obviously at medical dose level rather than at the health food level that what we might have in terms of benefiting our health. And they wouldn't have known that, as Jodie says, we would not have known this without this result. So they were able to go on to medical dosages of CoQ10, and last time I was there, Meg was trying to skate in the kitchen. It was hair-raising but hilarious, and both girls, they're still a little bit wobbly, but they are able to move, walk, their quality of life is not degenerating in any way. So in this room, I know that we collectively know this experience, and there's this mystery around rare diseases. We don't know what they are, and we're still discovering what they are. There's questions about all the testing that occurs as we go to find an answer. And we have talked, as Vicky has said many times already today, about the long diagnostic odyssey that people endure in order to find an answer. And then, of course, that point where generally you're not as lucky as Charlie in terms of there are not necessarily therapeutic interventions that are clear. But the other thing that I do want to mention is that in the rare disease space, we talked, so today it's already been talked about 5,000 rare diseases, 6,000 rare diseases, 8,000 rare diseases. We've currently had a study come out suggesting that there are over 10,000 known rare diseases at the moment. We know that prevalence is not a fixed number at this point in time. And that's partly because of the growth of what we are doing in terms of understanding diagnosis. The methods for diagnosis previously, 10 years ago, didn't exist in the way that they exist today. So the other day I got a phone call from a mother saying, we've just got a diagnosis. Why didn't we get this diagnosis 10 years ago, Shirlene? And I said, well, to be honest, 10 years ago, we couldn't find this. There's no way we could find this because A, we didn't have the technology, and B, we didn't have the knowledge. And this is something that I kind of want to talk about and just keep resonant in your mind as we go through the rest of this presentation. So I just want to explain this. In the past, what I've talked a lot about, and this slide still kind of highlights the evolution of genetic disease testing. So I know that there are some conditions that do not have a genetic basis, but 80% of rare diseases, as we know of them now, do seem to have a genetic basis. And so what we've often done is there has been repeated genetic testing in people's experiences. And this has taken a number of different forms as the technology has developed. So when someone comes to me and says, oh, but I've had genetic testing done and it didn't show anything, often we get down to they might have had a single gene test because it was assumed that it was Angelman syndrome. They might have had a FISH analysis done, which is a particular closed view of a particular number of genes. They might have had karyotype testing, which looks at the chromosomes and can't necessarily reveal everything. Or they might have had phenotypic panels. So phenotypic panels, some of you will be familiar with these. If symptoms look like they're epilepsy symptoms, there are epilepsy panels. These don't, again, incorporate all the genes, but they look at a select few and a select few variants that are linked with certain phenotypes. As it says there, there's often around 200 genes in that panel. We have multi-phenotype panels, so these are larger panels that start to look at 700 to possibly up to 7,000 genes. And then as we've moved on, we've started looking at a broader spectrum in terms of the human genome. And in this, we've started to see people employing whole exome, and this has been much more successful. So this looks at the coding areas within a person's genome, so those areas that code for particular behaviours. And then we've seen SNV and CNV, and more importantly, as we've kind of continued, we've started to see progress into the whole genome. And one of the people that I hold in high regard as my kind of North Star, he talks about, Shirlene, if we look at the whole genome and we're hunting for something, it's better than taking just a chunk of the haystack and hoping that you've got the needle in that chunk that you've taken off. If we've got the whole haystack, we've got a better chance of finding that needle. Obviously, it's still a needle in a haystack, but we've got a better chance of finding it. What I want to suggest in this, so while this is described as an evolution, and this is a timeline in some ways, it's also perhaps useful to think about it in terms of resolution. So that, by that I mean our actual view. And I often, when I'm sitting here going like this as I'm talking, but I often think about those people that I used to observe in the lab who were literally looking down the microscope, trying to count off the chromosomes before their tea break, and then coming back and trying to count, that you've got to count them so many times. So it's about the actual limitations of the actual view that you're getting on the whole system, on the healthcare system, on the body, and on the genome. So what we're seeing is that as this increases, we're coming to know a whole lot more about rare diseases. We're coming to be able to define them with a little bit more accuracy. So we're coming to be able to give definitive causes for conditions in a way that we haven't been able to before. And as we're doing that, this is changing the landscape rather dramatically. It's changing the landscape both in terms of prevalence, like I've talked about. It's also changing how we start to interpret rare diseases, what they're called, what their impact is, all those sorts of things. But we're also understanding that genomic variation within humans is diverse. We don't know, most of what we know at the moment is based on a European male reference system, and we need to increase that diversity, increase the data in which it's going. But as we're doing that, we're recognizing that people often don't just have one variation that is causing their condition. It's becoming more common to also have 2 variations, 3 variations that perhaps are the cause of their condition. So there's just been a study published actually just this week that I want to talk about in terms of the value of this and the value of expanding how are we looking? How are we actually decreasing that diagnostic odyssey? How are we giving an answer earlier? Could whole genome potentially be an answer for a first-tier test? And what do we need to do to get there? So in what conditions is it looking like it can be an answer as a first-tier test, meaning that all that other testing can go out the window and we can just start with something that might provide us with a definitive answer. We've still got a long way to go in terms of this evidence. But as I said, there's been a study that's been just published just this week. It's drawn on data from the Rady Institute in the US, from the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto, from Genomics England, from a number of other studies. It's over 70 studies have been incorporated into this review, with obviously tens of thousands of patients being included. And in this study, they've just announced 5 recommendations in which we should be arguing for whole genome as a first-tier test to end the diagnostic odyssey, to reduce that time to accuracy of diagnosis. And one of those is as a first-time test, particularly for pediatric patients or for new infants who end up in a NICU, so a neonatal intensive care or an intensive care. And that's obviously with unexplained symptoms, so this is in the cases where it's not clear, it's not an accidental cause as to why someone is in intensive care. But the diagnosis rate in those contexts is proving to be really, really high and incredibly valuable. And we have an example in the UK, actually, at Exeter, where they have a really rapid turnaround system. So this is another issue. We've always thought that whole genome takes years to do or months to do. Actually, Exeter has managed to introduce it with a turnaround time that is appropriate for those neonatal intensive care units and give an answer really rapidly. The other recommendation is that whole genome be recommended when sequential tests are being considered because it's not clear of the results. So most of us know that in our rare disease journeys, there have been sequential tests. There has been a test for a particular syndrome, there has been a panel, there has been maybe then exome and maybe then genome. I know many families for whom the first sample was Angelman syndrome, then the second was whole exome, and it might have revealed a variant, and then you need to test it against the parents, and that parent has that variant as well, now we need to do whole genome before you get an answer. So if that's the case, they're recommending that actually what we should be doing is whole genome as a first-tier test. The third point was instead of panel testing, especially when it is known that not all the variants are collected within that are connected with that phenotype are within the panel. That's perhaps a much more challenging recommendation. I was quite surprised to see that, but I think it's an important point. And they also said that when patients are being treated for a non-genetic condition, but have a clinical course or response to therapy that may be better explained through exploring whole genome sequencing. So value has been seen in projects across Europe. Some of you will be aware of other projects that are implementing whole genome. So for example, after much work by the patient organisation AXA and by Christine Monlos, there's been kind of a lot of work. This has been almost 10 years in the making. The German government has now decreed that all rare disease patients will have whole genome as a first-tier test, and that's about to be launched in April. It's a pilot project, it's called the Model Project, and it will run for 5 years and check the data and see, is this something that we're going to implement? But we see moves happening across different European countries, across the US, and obviously in the UK as well, where this has been explored in terms of the value. Now, Vicky also asked me to talk a little bit about AI and data. Now, obviously, whole genome raises a whole lot of questions about data. It produces just an enormous amount of data, and what do we do with that? And we've also heard today about the carrying of hospital records. So I know mothers particularly seem to bear a disproportional responsibility for collating the evidence around their child's condition and carrying it from specialist to specialist. I've seen folders that are honestly this thick or require one of those trolleys to take in to each different clinician that they go to. So what does this mean in terms of data, and how are we going to explore this? And I think there are some answers coming in electronic health records that we're seeing implemented in different countries that are starting to help that process and streamline that process. But also, I want to say that we need to do this as the interpretation of what this data is telling us. So whole genome sequencing is obviously complicated in terms of the data that comes from it. And the more that we learn, the more variants that we find, the more we're going to uncover variants that are called variants of unknown significance, where we haven't seen them before, we don't know what they are. How do we collate that data then? If we haven't seen what they are and we do a quick search on scientific papers to see if anyone else has reported them, and someone hasn't reported them because it's a variant of unknown significance, how do we actually start to find and collate those variants of unknown significance that might actually be pathogenic when we collate that data? So there's a lot of AI technology going into developing this, into thinking about how do we build networks where we think about this data, we bring it together. We know this in the rare disease space. We know that by virtue of being rare, we need to find each other, and we need to build collaboration, and we need to share data. It's not without its issues, but this is of extreme value, particularly in the rare disease space, and particularly, actually, as we grow in prevalence, as we grow in the understanding of conditions, and how maybe it's going to be more useful to group certain gene conditions together under certain umbrellas rather than them being known as the old school syndrome names that they have been known of in the past. Alongside this, there's AI technology that's being developed to help lead towards the diagnosis, to help build the value case. So a lot of us will be aware of some of the facial phenotyping work, particularly that is significant in low middle income countries. So I think of Gareth Bainham and his work in Aboriginal Australians, and that when you can't get people out there, how do you take effective imagery that might actually help to lead to evidence for doing further testing to explain the condition. Again, all of these systems require data, and they require a sharing of data. And this is the big issue that we still have to overcome. We're working hard on it with the European Health Data Space, but this is something that we're still thinking about very carefully. The other project that I do just want to flag up while I'm talking about AI, some of you will know Julian Ayala, who is a patient advocate based in Spain. He has a son with a rare disease. He has a background in Microsoft, and he has developed an incredible technology that is using language systems to read all the clinical notes that people are collating, and to then basically pinpoint a selection of, or a hub of possible scenarios. And we know that, well, I know that we all do this anyhow. People say don't go to Google, but everyone starts Googling in their search to try and find a diagnosis. And this is like a more systematic kind of approach of how do we use Google, how can we use the language that we're seeing, how do we type in the exact symptoms that are going to raise the profile of what we're looking at. So there's a number of incredible initiatives going on. And how they all join up yet is yet to be seen, but I think there's enormous potential there. And I have to say, as a sociologist, I've often been scared about the whole data issue. So me even saying this is a huge, huge step. So, we're getting there. We're all getting there in terms of what's needed to improve the space. I just wanted to touch on newborn screening as well before we conclude. So, one of the things that I want to talk about really is, I think it's probably best to reference a study that again has just been published at the end of last year. This is a review of what is occurring in the newborn screening space. It's a review then that occurred looking at newborn screening projects that were happening across Europe that were utilising NGS technology, so next generation sequencing technology. And what the authors did was they admit that this might not be exhaustive because a lot of these projects are research-based, but they looked across Europe to see and to survey then the leads, the healthcare professional leads of these projects, and to kind of identify what they were looking at, how they were utilising it, and what were their views. So you can see there on the slide, there's an image of the initiatives that they were able to identify. So there's Baby Screen, there's Screen for Care. Some of you will have heard of Screen for Care is the multinational one, so that is reflected twice, really, in terms of Germany and Italy. And I think it's also going to have a site in Greece. And what I did like about this study, so it's something that I've put the reference there, and you can go away and have a look at it. This is all research-based at the moment, so it's seen as sitting alongside the current newborn screening initiatives. But what is happening in the patient advocacy space is as we're identifying more and more rare diseases, and as we're changing, I guess, the measures by which we talk about utility, so that is, in the past, we've always talked about clinical utility as being measured by, is there a treatment? In the patient advocacy space, we're saying, actually, we need to talk about what is actionable. When is something actionable? And actionability is much more diverse than just treatment. Treatment is diverse in itself, but it can be about reproductive decision-making. It can be about food choice. It can be about a whole lot of different things. It can be about, in osteogenesis imperfecta, it can be about handling a baby in a way and knowing that you're not breaking its bones and not the cause of the condition that they are then ended up in hospital for again and again and again. So is that actionability? So this is a huge swing that we're seeing in terms of how we're thinking about these conditions, and as we're identifying more conditions and as we're reducing the diagnostic odyssey, we're seeing the potential for development of therapies change. Therefore, this is going to change how we do newborn screening. And the test system that we have, the biochemistry test system that we have, may not be fit for purpose in the future. So there's this idea, if we look at genomes, are we able to select, like with treatments, that we're going to, like with panels, that we're going to look for these genes, we're going to look for these conditions, and what would that look like? What would public acceptability of that look like? And one of the great things that they did in this review as well was explore with each of these studies what who they were engaging with in terms of their stakeholders. And some of these studies, so the French study particularly has had a really remarkable project that has started very much with both the patients, rare disease patients, and then with public and citizens about acceptability and moving that forward before they even got to the point of looking at ethical approval for continuing. Those studies are proving to be really, really important. And I think that's something that we need to remember. And it's talked about this morning is that even the difference in the current plan is that we're including patient voice right at the beginning and embedding it within that. And I think we need to do this also not only with patients, but at a citizenry level. And I know Ireland has a great history of doing this really, really well. The other thing that's interesting about who they've been including is other professional societies, but also making sure that they're including those decision makers on newborn screening panels in this whole process as well. Because the view is not that this is going to automatically roll out into and be adopted and implemented. It may be that it sits alongside our newborn screening projects for a while or programs for a while. But one of the things that they did say, so one of the respondents believes that NGS-based sequencing will replace biochemical pretty much very soon. However, with all of them being research-driven, a lot are saying that it's going to take a little bit more time. But interestingly, all of these people said that in the next 10 to 15 years, they think this will be adopted as a first-tier test, as a mechanism for newborn screening. So I guess to conclude, really, I just wanted to talk about how, as we're seeing changes in this whole landscape, in this ecosystem that are being so elegantly led by the patient advocates who are bringing multiple stakeholders to the same table, like today, to discuss issues that cross so many different systems, we're seeing change happening in this space. And the result is that in providing accuracy of diagnosis, we're better able to change the landscape in terms of treatments. We're better able to do the research that leads to successful treatments. That means that children are not being experimented on because we don't necessarily know what's wrong, and so they're being given certain treatments that may actually be causing more harm than good. This is coupled with the technological advances that we're seeing, so especially in genomic sequencing, and particularly again in the reduction of that turnaround time. So being able to produce a result back to bioinformatics to interpret within a very short space of time. And then we're starting to see the advances that we need in computational and artificial intelligence advances, which help with that interpretation. And I think as this system evolves hand in hand all together, as these advances are happening, we're seeing quite a transformation, what I think is quite a potential transformation in the rare disease space. So in terms of the quote that I started with, we started with that life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forward. And what I want to just remind you of is that we're talking about a particular time in history at the moment. We are talking about advances that we're coming to know about, that we don't know about fully, but they are changing that space. That once upon a time, this is what was happening. So it used to be that, a rare disease diagnosis was taking, on average, 12 years. One mother said to me that it took 18 years for them to get their diagnosis. And once they got their diagnosis, that was the end for them. That was the end of their diagnostic odyssey. But what we're starting to see with this accuracy now is that, yes, this answer is an ending to a diagnostic odyssey. It's being shortened, but it's an entry point. So this accuracy becomes an entry point to our national plans. It becomes the entry point from which we can facilitate future research. It becomes an entry point by which we start to develop our understandings and develop the ecosystem, recognizing the broad range of stakeholders that need to be involved. It doesn't end with diagnosis, we all know that. The battles that continue post that are immense and often very varied, but it is the starting point. And Avril said right at the beginning that society is judged by how it treats unmet need. And I think this is a crux for us at the moment. This is a real crux in terms of how do we move this forward? How do we recognise the potential? How do we see the change that this can bring for the real life experience of families, of children particularly, and change this whole landscape for where rare disease sits, how it's understood and how it's interpreted. So there's been a lot of references to the Rare 2030 Foresight Study, to the EU plan, to the national plans. But I really want to stand alongside the IRDIC promise too, so the International Rare Disease Research Community promise, and Eurodis, who are saying that they imagine a future, we all imagine a future in which people can come to a diagnosis within a year of coming to medical attention. And that's, at times that can feel like a scary goal, but actually I think it's an achievable goal. It's an ambitious goal, but it's something in terms of things are there. We've just got to join up these systems now and start to work out what does this look like, how can we implement it, and where is the work that we need to do. That's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charlene. If you'd like to take a seat at the top table. And at this point, we'll invite the panel up, please. We have Nuala Ryan. She's the Chair and Board of Trustees of NCBRS Worldwide Foundation. We have Richard Hagan, who's the Interim National Clinical Laboratory Director. He's also from the National Genetics and Genomics Office and the Chief Medical Scientist Laboratory Co-Director of the Irish Blood Transfusion Service. And we've also got Abigail Collins, the National Clinical Lead of Child Health and Public Health. So, Charlene, we might just start with you. So, one question first. You mentioned the neonatal units in Exeter.
Yeah.
I was particularly interested in how rapidly can they turn around whole genome sequencing. I suppose essentially how, and have they got a machine on site?
So yes, Exeter do have a machine on site. So the turnaround time there for the actual sequencing, so I do just want to make sure that we're aware of so there's library prep that needs to occur on the sample prior to it having sequencing, but sequencing can occur within 24 hours. And then there's the interpretation. So I'm not sure of the exact turnaround time. Johnny, do you know? I think it's around 48 hours or something like that they're getting results back. Obviously, we might think that that's not necessarily fast enough just yet, but it's incredible progress, and 2 days for a result within the NICU is really amazing. So Exeter is doing that. We also, I was going to just mention, and I didn't mention it in my talk, but there's another example that I think is rather exemplary, and I know we often get annoyed, if I dare say this, that the cancer space seems to, be able to sort pathways out. But this is in pediatric cancer, pediatric cancers are considered very rare cancers. And one of the most extraordinary moments for me in the last couple of years has been visiting Princess Maxima Hospital in the Netherlands, and I'm not sure if people are aware of it. So if you are diagnosed with pediatric cancer in the Netherlands, all pediatric cancer cases go to Princess Maxima. And if you go to Princess Maxima, it's one of those settings that is purpose-built to not only give answers, but to facilitate appropriate personalised treatments. So it is set up, the wards are beautiful, there's like hospital wards, there's even a band room, like it's pretty cool, like there's a lot of cool stuff there. But then suddenly there's this big glass wall, and you go behind that, and it is the biggest hive of activity that you've ever seen. So the sequences are there, everything, every piece of kit that you might imagine that is needed to give answers to children. there are lab technicians, there are bioinformaticians. They all are working there, so that the data goes backwards and forwards within the same building. It goes through those glass walls and comes back. So the development of therapies then is happening on a really personalised level, is being tested on site, moving to the child, going back. It is one of the most remarkable examples, I think, of what can be achieved in this space.
Okay, thank you. A question to Nuala Ryan. Thinking about the importance of diagnosis, how has having a diagnosis helped your family, and is there anything that you think you might have done differently had you known earlier?
All right, so my child has a syndrome called NCBRS. We found out when he was 12 that he had this diagnosis. But immediately having that diagnosis meant that I could go out there, start researching. I mean, when I was told the diagnosis, I was told, well, there's no treatment for it, so it wouldn't really have made a difference. But, you know, from a personal point of view, it made a huge difference, because immediately we were able to know what to expect in the future, you know, how the syndrome developed with age, you know, some of the symptoms, you know, how best to manage them, what interventions worked, proactive planning, because we could see that, you know, there was issues with sight. So some of the kids in their 20s had gone blind because of glaucoma or by cataracts, and because the children couldn't communicate, they couldn't say that. But, you know, you could then be proactive and have those tests done. It's easily to test for those if you know that that's a possibility. But it also helped me as a parent to be more proactive. And now you know, we've set up the foundation. We're able to, even though it may not help Charlie, I have another Charlie, we can help make those treatments available in the future and feel like you're making a difference and doing something, which I think is important as a parent. In terms of what I would have done, what would have been different had I known, I think some of those proactive things. I mean, Charlie ended up in ICU, you know, with status epilepticus. Epilepsy is kind of a common thing with the syndrome, but we didn't know that. So we would have been able to do that. It would have avoided some of the tests that he did have. He has short stature as part of the syndrome, so all those growth hormone tests and stimulation and all that. So I think we would have also, now Charlie's lucky in that he can speak. He didn't speak till he was 5 or 6. But I think, again, we were told, look, he probably will never speak, but I think had we known and seen the kind of spectrum of children with that, we could have got earlier intervention. We would have had that power to say, I think a diagnosis opens up more doors to get certain interventions, knowing that that is something that's associated with, so yeah.
Thank you. Question to Richard. So leveraging scientific advances, terms such as whole genome sequencing, metabolomics, proteomics, and artificial intelligence are becoming increasingly commonly used. So how near or far do you think we are from embracing some of this, and maybe even leapfrogging today's technology?
Yeah, I'd just like to say, Shirlene, your talk was fantastic. Spoke to a lot of what we're looking at for the National Genetic and Genomics Office, which is recently established. That leapfrogging piece is exactly a conversation with Shirlene earlier, just as to, you know, what is that in 5 years' time? What should we be looking at? What should we be looking to implement in terms of our technologies and capabilities? So building from the ground up pretty much is where we're working from in this country, or where most of our samples will be sent away to the UK and labs in Europe for the sequencing. We have no public service capability within the country for whole exome or whole genome sequencing at the moment. So in terms of building capacity and capability, you know, do we start out by going straight to whole genome sequencing? Is that where we should be looking at? Again, reference to other pieces, the methylation proteomics and transcriptomics and so on. Those are all pieces that we have to take on board in terms to build a service for this country. And obviously there are a lot of challenges from infrastructure, IT, AI, workforce planning, governance and funding. All of those pieces we're working together with offices, National Rare Disease Office, Eileen, obviously we've been working closely with NCCP, NWIP and so on. And so we're aware of the challenges, but definitely in terms of very much looking to what that future place will look like and how we deliver those services, we'd definitely very much look to leapfrog into that space.
Thank you. So a question for Abigail. when we talk about newborn screening, we all think about the heel prick test, but of course there are many other tests and screening activities too. What should we be thinking about? You know, is there anything outside of the box we should be thinking about as well? Possibly facial recognition. You know, what's your opinion on other possibilities?
Yeah, and I think, you know, technology is showing us there are endless possibilities for how we, you know, how we look at things. You know, sometimes things come down to sort of how you define what you want to achieve and what is associated with those definitions. So, you know, from my perspective, we have the Universal Programme of Clinical Care for all children, and that's a universal programme. A lot of those bits are called screening, but in terms of real population screening programmes in the end-to-end way, we have the newborn blood spot screening programme, which many of you know as the sort of the Guthrie test, the heel prick test, and we have the hearing screening programme, and they are, you know, they're fantastic programmes in terms of that we can look and we can kind of see end-to-end what's happening, and it's easier to sort of see your gaps and your spaces and where you can go. Even within those pieces, you know, there is the context of where do we go with technology? Where is the sort of functional response that we get from the blood spot screening program that is of real value and a fairly quick turnaround time to our clinicians, blend with the sort of, you know, the molecular information that sometimes can take a while. We can get the answer before we know what the answer means sometimes. You know, we can get a genetic answer, but we don't quite know what that's going to mean for the patient in terms of their clinical day-to-day activity. So I think there's going to be, our engagement is going to be important, and I think there's always going to be that overlap between sort of functional and molecular in this kind of short term. And then I suppose for me there is this kind of broader piece for children, and I think you had a really nice phrase when you in your presentation, which was lovely. I agree with Richard when you say, you know, what does public acceptability look like? And I think that is really key, which is slightly different from this kind of screening or pseudo screening or checks or surveillance side to there's something not quite right with my child that I'm worried about. So as a parent, when you have a concern with a child, what you are happy to do in a kind of clinical perspective is slightly different. We know it's slightly different from what our parent who has a child that they don't consider has any clinical concerns are prepared to do. And that's always the kind of challenge and the balance. And I suppose, you know, lots of countries have come up with solutions like the Screening Advisory Committee, which are really tasked with that kind of looking at that blend of we want to get the throughput to where we need to get to support children and families, but we have to respect, you know, we have to respect the sort of the parent space as well as the patient space. So that's always really an interesting challenge, and I think the advent of technologies will accelerate those conversations, and I think it's really important we have them. And you're right, we do have a really nice kind of history in Ireland of having those kind of tricky public conversations, and I think, you know, this is one that would be nice to see touching on that engagement more, and I think that will help us in our sort of strategic way forward.
Okay, thank you.
Pick up on that a little bit?
Yeah, and then we'll open up to the floor for questions.
So, I think what you've said is a really important point, and I didn't bring it out of my conversation, but it is quite different. In the space, in the rare disease space, we've known this long search. There's clearly been something that needs an answer. And that is quite different when we're talking about the application of sequencing at a population screening level. Avril mentioned earlier the Rare Barometer survey. I think that's really informative, actually, because we've just done 2 surveys, one on diagnosis and one on newborn screening. And the results of that will be published, I think, around May. But the results of that are quite striking in terms of public acceptability, and I think that's why these projects around public acceptability are important. But the other thing I didn't mention, what I think has been really useful in the research projects around newborn sequencing, is that they're also incorporated, many of them have incorporated studies about how do you get a good genome, you know, so how do you get a sample. And I do want to just kind of dispel the myth too that this replaces the blood spot test, because actually what we've seen, and I think in each of those studies at the moment, is that if we can get good enough genomes from the blood spot. That's obviously the way we still want to go through. So this is not a kind of, let's replace the blood spot and get rid of, and then, oh, are we going to bleed babies, to get a genome? No, I do just want to make sure and clarify on that point.
Yeah, and I think that's right. I think that's important, and that would be part of that public acceptability.
Exactly.
And operational feasibility is one thing to do a heel prick. It's another thing to, take a venous sample from every baby in the country, for example. But I think there's something else as well. There will probably likely be an overlap period in terms of technologies because of that functional information. So do you have the chemical or not, and therefore can we start the treatment? Which genetic information may not tell you that, because you can have a sort of a spectrum that we're not quite sure. Some very classical types you might know that's fine, we need to get on and give this medicine or this treatment or this pathway. But sometimes clinicians are left not quite sure, and that's always going to be a challenging space. And I suppose the one thing that the more conventional sort of tandem mass spec and methodologies that are used in the blood spot screening program, for example, give you that functional information actually in a tight turnaround time still currently. So I don't think it's going to be a case of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. No. I think it's going to be a case of actually these things are evolving, and we need to involve in tandem with technologies for clinical output and in tandem with patient and public acceptability. And I think those are conversations we need to have together.
Thank you. Just in the interest of time, we'll take a few questions from the floor, but if there's any longer questions or really burning things, we might save them just for the break. So, go ahead, Mary.
I have a short question and a comment. I just wanted to tell the panel about a mother who came to me. She qualified for genome testing. She had her paediatric neurologist in a major teaching hospital in Dublin do the genome testing. She didn't get the proper diagnosis. He was stuffing it down her neck that the child had cerebral palsy. So she had to go privately. She was just determined to get an answer, spend the €10,000. The genome testing was repeated and the clinician gave the required clinical information and she got an answer. So that's what's happening on the ground.
Yeah.
And just earlier we had somebody from PSP say about doctors should really push the patient organisations, and I think he's right, but sometimes the patients don't want to go to the patient organisations, and I just think that's something we need to think about. And I found myself, even though I had medical qualifications and all the rest, it was my non-medical husband pushed me and said, go on to the patient organisation and see what they have. But certainly a paediatric neurologist with an expertise in this, saying it's cystic fibrosis or a cerebral palsy and nothing else, and
To bring back to Nuala, I know in your world and in the conversation that we had before today, I'm really interested in actionable versus treatable. What does that really mean? What's really happening there? Because I know Shirley referred to it as well, and I think it's, it brings, I guess it goes to the back of the ranch, as Anne Lawler might discuss.
So I'm actually working on a project as well, Screen for Care, that you referred to earlier, and part of that is newborn screening, and really they are looking at that, kind of trying to standardise across Europe for newborn screening, and they're really qualifying it based on an actionable panel and a treatable panel. So treatable, I think, is the kind of what we're seeing more now. It's, is there a treatment available, whether it be a drug or a gene therapy or a diet supplement, let's say for PKU or something like that. But actionable is much broader and much more relevant in terms of what I would kind of see. So, it could be looking at interventions, that proactive health management and social, which will help the overall quality of life and social kind of integration of a patient, making sure that, looking at the health management plan, looking at and I think it goes beyond the patient as well, because it's really looking at the family, the caregiver, it's looking at all that reproductive planning, that whole infrastructure around the patient. So that's why I think the actionable is much more important. I think with both of them, when you're looking at what needs to be taken into account, of course, you're looking at what's the severity, of that, what's going to happen. Is it, prevalence. There's all kinds of criteria that you could have to look at for those actionable panels or treatable panels. But I think it is really important that we are looking at beyond that treat and making it a much more broader categorisation. Yeah.
Vicky, you actually, I think, kind of read my mind there. That's exactly what I was kind of going to ask. In my community, in the retinal degeneration community, we've done a landscape study across Europe, and it is going back to this issue of, we talk about what happens when you get the test. It's such a challenge to actually get access to the test, because it's 5 years, 5 different clinical consultations to be referred in the absence of treatment.
Yeah.
And that's the challenge, because you can take action in the absence of treatment. And I think it's a mindset that we need to shift as society to that genetic testing is specific, it's niche, it's much more than that, and advances, as you've referred to, demonstrate that. But we need to understand that. I know we've genes and genomic strategies being developed currently, but we must go away from that, and just as a patient representative in the retina space, I was told once, Avril, patients don't need genetic testing. And my answer is, we don't need to need it.
Yeah.
You know, we have to have it, particularly for complex genetic disorders. So I suppose it's a mindset that we all have to change. And back to your point as well, Mary, it's that education at primary care level as well, that's really important as to, you know, and also we must understand as well that patients get access to genetic testing from a research perspective, and they're not aware of the fact that there is no obligation to provide a diagnosis when you're involved in a research program, and you know, these are the things that we just as a society need to understand better.
I just want to pass a comment, and just listening very carefully there. And there's huge potential, obviously, in the genomic method, but my worry, I've been a long-term advocate for expansion of our newborn screening program here in Ireland for years now. And it's built momentum slowly, very slowly, but it is progressing, and I would hope to see it progress in the coming years. My worry would be that, and you've mentioned it and addressed it, but I'd like to reiterate it, that this is not a replacement or a substitute for the further development of our existing program, which lags way behind international standards and needs improvement and rapid improvement in parallel, and I would say prioritization to the development of our traditional method in parallel to the overall development of this, you know, much more long-term project in an Irish context, given our limitations. But yeah, I want to just bring the focus back to the day, to, you know, today.
Yeah.
And I say that on behalf of the parents of the children that will be born next week and the week after and the week after, every week in Ireland now, that require screening for conditions that is available in other countries but not available here. So we're failing those parents and those patients currently, and we need to get up to speed. It's not that we have to make huge advances in an international context, we just have to catch up with what others are doing. You know, somebody said a measure of our society is how we meet unmet needs, but I would go further and say the measure of the society is a measure of an adult human, is how they look after the infants, you know, our newborn babies. It's our most basic instincts. And I've been saying this for years, as I said, but that's my true belief, is that as a society we're failing our most vulnerable citizens, and as parents and adults we're failing our children on that front. I don't want to leave it on that negative note. We're not failing, we're advancing, and there's promising progress in the field, but I did want to bring it back.
No,
what we're dealing with today.
I just want to say thank you for, I know that I touched on that, but I think we're very aware of the disparities across Europe in terms of newborn screening programs. I mean, it's enormous, and there's several studies that can map that out, and we've got a long way to go, and that should be happening now at some conditions.
Okay. Could I make one final point, Vicky? Very quickly. Just, I mean, I think in terms you mentioned about the exome and the whole genome, I mean, I think it's important to note that sometimes it'll come up with a variant that may consider, like for Charlie, 10 years before he's actually diagnosed, we knew that this was the variant that was probably his issue. But because it sits in a paper file, there's no one able to go back and relook at that. So I'm just thinking, in terms of the diagnostic journey, you need to have the data infrastructure to have that information in the database, whether it be using AI then for any new conditions that are recognised, I suppose, after that initial gene test is done, that it links up the pieces and that people get a diagnosis as quickly as possible as that new information comes available, because it's too manual at the moment to make it an easy process. That's all I wanted to say.
Just before we conclude, one very quick question to Shirlene. Myself and Les Martin are working with a researcher in the US who actually received the Guthrie Award in recent years. And he's classifying all 6,000 variants, potential variants of MLD, and also he's working with a group in Germany for my son's condition, and they're classifying all 6,000 variants for MSD. You know, when you think about, you know, a diagnosis, you know, getting the whole genome sequencing, you get the readout and you might have variants of unknown significance, or you might have 2 variants of unknown significance. We're creating basically a encyclopedia which will be there for all time, so that if there is a treatment, then you might think, well, is this patient going to respond to that treatment? Are we sure this is actually these are pathogenic variants? For me, this is the future. And yes, this is subsequent after we get a potential diagnosis. What do you think? Do you think that something like this is a good business model for a company like Illumina, or do you think this is like, no, we can't have like 10,000 research projects trying to do this for 10,000 rare diseases when you take in different genetic variants and whatnot within individual diseases? Do you think this is something for the future?
I think this is definitely a project for the future. In fact, I've got something that I'm developing at the moment just around VUSs, because as you've said, they can sit there and there's no system at the moment for going back to those VUSs unless you know that that VUS is even being reported to you. So often VUSs aren't reported back in any way, shape or form. So patients don't have access to that data to then be able to fight on that. But also in certain systems, after 3 years, you're able to get the lab to re-examine it in some countries. But people don't know that, and if they don't know that they've got a VUS, they don't know that they can get that reassessed. So the issue is that at the moment we don't have a system that is growing with the knowledge in real time. And I think this is where, you know, I touched on AI as being a mechanism by which we can start to do that. I think we need new systems that talk between ClinVar and all those programs that are being utilised for assessing pathogenicity of variants, but we don't have systems that are doing that talking to enable quicker reassessment. So I think this is an enormous issue going forward. I think it's an important issue. I don't have a business proposal, but
Yeah, I think we need somebody to take this on, because for me that's the future. And it really makes a lot of people's job easier as well. Okay, thanks very much, ladies and gents. We'll go to lunch now, and if there's any questions for the panel,